The timing wasn't accidental, it was the tell. Europe pledged 90 billion euros to Ukraine, the largest financial commitment of the entire war. Leaders called it historic, proof of resolve, proof that Europe would stand for as long as it takes. Then, barely 48 hours later, one of Europe's most powerful leaders publicly floated talks with Putin. No warning, no explanation, no apology. That wasn't diplomacy, it was panic. And what it revealed wasn't unity. It was the beginning of Europe's retreat. For nearly 3 years, Emmanuel Macron positioned himself as one of Ukraine's loudest European champions. Every speech condemned Russian aggression. Every visit to Kiev promised unwavering support. Every EU summit ended with Macron pushing for more sanctions, more weapons, more money. France, he said, would not waver. Then came the $90 billion loan. This wasn't symbolic aid. It wasn't incremental support. It was the single largest financial commitment Europe has made to any conflict since World War II, bigger than previous Ukraine packages, bigger than any crisis bailout in modern EU history. And that's when the tone changed. Within 2 days of finalizing the loan, Macron told French media that the time for dialogue is approaching, and that Europe must begin exploring diplomatic channels with Russia. The shift was breathtaking, from maximum confrontation to diplomatic outreach, instantly. The official explanation was vague: strategic maturity, responsible leadership, avoiding escalation. But none of that explains the timing, because Macron didn't discover diplomacy overnight. What he discovered was the bill. Here's the detail buried beneath the headlines. The European Union does not have 90 billion. The EU's entire annual budget is roughly $170 billion for everything: agriculture, infrastructure, climate, administration, defense coordination, all of it. So how did Europe give Ukraine 90 billion? It borrowed the money. The European Commission will issue long-term bonds backed by collective EU guarantees. Financial markets buy the bonds. The cash goes to Ukraine. On paper, Ukraine is supposed to repay the loan over decades. In reality, that will never happen. Ukraine's economy has shrunk dramatically since the war began. GDP is a fraction of pre-war levels. Public debt is approaching unsustainable territory. There is no realistic scenario in which Ukraine repays $90 billion. Everyone involved knows this, which means the loans will eventually be written off, restructured, or converted into grants. And that means EU member states will absorb the losses. This is where Macron's panic begins. Losses on EU debt are shared according to GDP weight. Germany carries roughly 25%. France carries around 17%. Together, France and Germany will absorb over 40% of the cost. That's nearly $38 billion. French taxpayers will pay for a war with no clear end, right as France heads toward one of the most volatile election cycles in decades. Macron didn't pivot toward Putin because he suddenly believed in peace. He pivoted because the $90 billion made Europe's commitment permanent. Temporary aid can be defended. Generational debt cannot. And once that reality set in, the strategy collapsed. The political danger of the $90 billion loan isn't abstract, it's immediate. France is heading toward legislative elections in 2027, and Macron's position is already fragile. His approval ratings are among the lowest of his presidency. The far-right National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, is polling at historic highs. And Ukraine's spending is political poison. Every euro that goes to Kiev becomes ammunition at home. Macron funds foreign wars while French hospitals close. Macron chose Kiev over French workers. Macron bankrupted France for someone else's war. The messaging writes itself. What made the $90 billion loan different from previous aid packages is that it destroyed plausible deniability. Before, Ukraine's support could be framed as temporary, emergency assistance until victory, stabilization, or resolution. The endpoint was vague. This loan is not vague. It has a 30-year structure. That means French voters are being asked to finance Ukraine well into the 2050s, long after Macron is gone, with no guarantee of victory, no guarantee of repayment, and no guarantee the war even ends. Germany faces the same trap, but with additional pressure. German industry is already collapsing under energy costs, sanctions blowback, and deindustrialization. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing. Growth is stagnant. The governing coalition is deeply unpopular. The AfD has made two issues central to its rise: opposition to Ukraine spending and opposition to sanctions on Russia. Every additional euro committed to Ukraine strengthens them. Scholz understands this. So does Macron. At the same time, the battlefield reality has turned against the political narrative. Ukraine's much-promised counteroffensives failed to produce a breakthrough. Russian defensive lines held. The war settled into an attritional grind with enormous human and financial costs. Western weapons didn't transform the battlefield the way leaders promised voters they would. This creates a lethal political equation. Rising costs, no visible progress, no clear victory, long-term financial exposure. Public opinion responds predictably. Across Europe, polling now shows growing majorities favoring negotiations over continued escalation. Support for as long as it takes is evaporating. And then came the American factor. Donald Trump's return to the White House in January 2025 changed everything. Trump made clear he wants negotiations. He openly questioned continued US funding. He suggested Europe should pay more if it wants the war to continue. That's the nightmare scenario for Europe. If the US reduces support, Ukraine's position deteriorates rapidly. Europe cannot replace American military aid at scale. But if Europe tries, the financial burden becomes catastrophic. Macron saw the convergence: elections, budgets, battlefield reality, and Washington. The $90 billion loan didn't strengthen Europe's resolve. It exposed its limit, and once leaders realize a commitment is unsustainable, they don't double down. They look for exits. What makes this moment so dangerous is how neatly the trap closed. By committing $90 billion, Europe maximized its financial exposure at the exact moment the pathway to Ukrainian victory became most uncertain. Every possible outcome now carries heavy costs and almost no political upside. If the war drags on, Europe pays billions every year with no resolution. If Ukraine agrees to a frozen conflict, Europe paid $90 billion for stalemate. If negotiations lead to territorial concessions, Europe paid $90 billion for defeat. If Ukraine collapses, Europe absorbs the loss and the humiliation. There is no winning scenario left. European finance ministries understand this. Scenario analyses circulating quietly in Brussels all reach the same conclusion: continued conflict is the most expensive option and delivers the least political benefit. The advice coming from technocrats is blunt: limit exposure, reduce risk, push towards settlement. Macron listened. His outreach to Putin wasn't about optimism, it was about positioning. By signaling openness to dialogue now, Macron creates a future narrative where France didn't retreat. It led diplomacy. When negotiations eventually happen, Macron can claim statesmanship instead of capitulation. That's why the timing matters. The pivot didn't come after battlefield changes. It didn't come after humanitarian breakthroughs. It came immediately after the loan finalized. Money forced the move. From Moscow's perspective, this is exactly what Russia planned for. Russia never needed to defeat Europe militarily. It needed to outlast Europe politically and financially. Attrition, patience, waiting for democratic pressure to overwhelm moral rhetoric. The $90 billion loan looked like strength. To Russia, it looked like desperation, a forced escalation designed to manufacture momentum that no longer exists on the battlefield. And now the signal is unmistakable. Europe is cracking. Russia's negotiating position improves every month the war continues. Time favors Moscow because European publics grow tired, budgets tighten, and political cycles shorten. Putin doesn't face elections on this timeline. European leaders do. The most alarming implication is for Ukraine itself. Ukraine built its entire strategy on one assumption: Western support was unconditional and open-ended. As long as it takes wasn't a slogan, it was the foundation of national survival. Macron's pivot shatters that assumption. It tells Kyiv what leaders will never say openly: Europe is looking for an exit, and when that exit comes, it may be negotiated over Ukraine's head. History offers plenty of examples of great powers settling wars without prioritizing the interests of smaller allies. Ukraine understands this, and it terrifies them. Here is the truth Europe isn't ready to admit. The $90 billion loan wasn't a sign of commitment. It was the moment Europe locked itself into a position it could no longer sustain. From that moment on, retreat became inevitable. Macron's call for dialogue wasn't diplomacy. It was damage control. He is preparing France and Europe for an outcome that would have been politically impossible just months ago. Territorial compromise, sanctions relief, a negotiated settlement framed as peace rather than defeat, and Ukraine knows what that means. If Europe pushes negotiations, Ukraine won't be an equal partner. It will be pressured. Financial support will become conditional. Military aid will slow. The message will be implicit but unmistakable. Accept the deal or stand alone. This is how wars end when great powers grow tired. Not with victory, with exhaustion. Russia understands this dynamic perfectly. Putin has been waiting for European fatigue, waiting for budgets to tighten, waiting for elections to loom. The moment Europe turned its support into generational debt, Russia's leverage exploded. Now every month that passes strengthens Moscow's hand. The precedent this sets is catastrophic. If Europe can spend $90 billion promise unwavering support, and then pivot to negotiation once the bill becomes politically painful, what does that say about future commitments? What does it tell Taiwan? What does it tell Eastern Europe? What does it tell any country betting its survival on Western guarantees? The message is brutal but clear. Support lasts only as long as it's affordable, and once it isn't, principles bend. That's why this moment matters far beyond Ukraine. This isn't just about one war. It's about whether Europe's promises mean anything when tested by time, money, and politics. The next moves are already being prepared. Quietly, off camera, behind diplomatic language designed to soften the landing. When the settlement finally comes, it won't be announced as a betrayal. It will be sold as realism. If you want to understand where this war is actually heading, if you want to see the next shift before it's admitted publicly, and if you want to know who benefits when Europe finally blinks, then stay here. Because Europe's call to Putin wasn't the end of the story, it was the signal, and the real consequences are just beginning.